I never expected a man like Richard to notice someone like me. At 61, I had grown used to being in the background. That quiet figure at the edge of every company gathering, the polite wife of a dependable employee. Mark had worked for Richard Caldwell's firm for over 27 years, long enough to earn respect, but not quite friendship. Richard was the kind of man who commanded a room without needing to speak loudly. Tall, silver-haired, with a presence that drew people in and kept them listening. I'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with him at annual events, a handshake, a compliment on my dress, a thank you for coming. Until that night. It was the firm's autumn banquet, a formal affair held at a downtown hotel, all chandeliers and deep wine tones, a jazz trio playing something soft in the corner. Mark was busy, as always, moving from table to table, shaking hands, catching up with colleagues. I had found a quiet spot by the windows, sipping water and watching the city lights blur in the distance. I hadn't realized how much I'd withdrawn until I saw my reflection in the glass. Shoulders slightly hunched, hair pinned back neatly but without care. I looked tired. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix, but the kind that grows in silence, in years of not being asked how you really are. That's when Richard approached me. No entourage, no clipboard, just him, with 2 glasses in hand. He offered one to me, sparkling water, and said nothing for a moment. We stood side by side, watching the street below. Then, in a voice quiet enough not to intrude, he said, "You don't like these events, do you?" I blinked. It was the first honest question anyone had asked me all evening. I told him the truth, that I found them overwhelming, that I often felt out of place, that sometimes I felt like a part of Mark's work uniform, brought out for special occasions. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away. "I used to feel that way too," he said. "When I was married." There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Just full. "She passed 6 years ago, cancer," he added simply. After she was gone, I started noticing who else stood quietly at these things. The ones no one talks to. I didn't know what to say, but I remember feeling my chest ache. Not for him. For myself. He asked me what I used to do before I became Mark's wife. The question caught me off guard. I told him I had once taught literature at a community college, long before the kids came, before I started fading into the periphery of everyone else's lives. His eyes didn't leave mine. "I thought you seemed like someone who paid attention to the spaces between words." That sentence settled deep inside me, like a stone dropped into still water. We spoke for no more than 15 minutes. Then he nodded, thanked me for the conversation, and slipped back into the crowd. But I didn't forget it. And something inside me, something that had been sleeping for a long, long time, began to stir. After the banquet, life returned to its usual rhythm, or at least, it tried to. Mark went back to his long hours and brief conversations. The house returned to its comfortable quiet. But something inside me remained unsettled. I found myself replaying Richard's words at odd moments, while folding laundry, while stirring soup, while brushing my hair at night. That simple observation about the spaces between words clung to me like a thread I couldn't untangle. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even attention in the romantic sense. It was being seen, truly seen, in a way I hadn't felt in years. A few weeks later, Mark came home late and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Richard would be visiting for dinner. "Just a casual thing," he said. "He likes to check in with people sometimes. Don't go to too much trouble." I nodded, but my heart started to flutter. That afternoon, I moved through the kitchen like someone preparing for something more than just a guest. I baked bread from scratch, something I hadn't done in years, and pulled out the linen napkins. Not for Richard, I told myself. For me. Dinner was simple. Roasted chicken, a salad with figs and walnuts, the bread still warm from the oven. Richard arrived precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine he said had been sitting unopened for too long. The meal passed easily. Mark talked shop, asked a few polite questions, then drifted into updates about the kids. I watched Richard watching the room. Not in judgment, just with awareness. He didn't dominate the conversation. He simply filled the space around him with calm. After dessert, Mark excused himself to take a work call. That left the two of us at the table, the candles still flickering, the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. Richard didn't speak right away. He just looked around the dining room, then down at his empty plate. Then he said, very softly, "It's a rare thing to be surrounded by people and still feel alone." I felt my throat tighten. He wasn't talking about himself, not entirely. He looked at me then, not inappropriately, not boldly, just openly. The dinner was lovely. But the part I enjoyed most was seeing you here, alive in it, not hidden. I looked away. I wasn't used to being spoken to like that. It felt like a mirror held gently to my face. Before Mark returned, Richard stood. He placed his napkin on the table and leaned in slightly. "You have more presence than you allow yourself to believe," he said. And then, just as calmly, he stepped back and said goodnight. When Mark walked in a moment later, I smiled as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing had. But inside, I felt a small door swing open. Not to a romance, not to a secret, but to a question I hadn't asked myself in a very long time. What would it feel like to come back to life? A few days later, I caught myself standing in front of the hallway mirror for longer than usual. Not out of vanity, that had long since faded from my habits, but out of curiosity. I traced the faint lines around my eyes, brushed my hair back, and wondered when I had stopped recognizing the woman in the glass. That morning, Mark left early. Another meeting. Another busy day. I watched him go with the same familiar quiet, then turned back to the dishes and the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. It was nearly noon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, Richard stood there. He held a small stack of books. "You mentioned teaching literature," he said. "I was clearing out a few shelves and thought you might like these." I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't stay long. Just enough time to place the books on the kitchen table and point out the one on top, a well-worn copy of a poetry collection I hadn't read in decades. "That one helped me once," he said simply, "when things felt blurry." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. After he left, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down with the book. The pages smelled like memory, soft, yellowed, familiar. I read slowly, tracing each line like it held something I had lost. And maybe it did. I started writing again that week. Not much, just small observations in a notebook I found in the back of a drawer. One entry read, "There is a quietness in being seen that feels more powerful than praise." The next time I saw Richard was at a charity event the firm had sponsored. It was held at a small gallery downtown. I hadn't planned to go, but Mark insisted it would be good to get out, to mingle. I wore a soft gray sweater dress and a pair of earrings I hadn't touched in years. When we arrived, Mark disappeared almost immediately into a conversation near the hors d'oeuvres table. I found a spot near a painting of a woman walking alone through a field. That's where Richard found me. He stood beside me for a moment before speaking. "You look rested," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. And for some reason, it made me feel more whole than anything I'd heard in a long time. "That painting reminds me of a passage from one of the books I brought you," he added. the one about solitude. I nodded. It doesn't feel as lonely as it looks. He smiled. We didn't talk much more, just stood in silence, watching the art, letting the hush of the gallery settle around us. When Mark called me over minutes later, I left with a small ache in my chest. Not longing, not attraction, recognition. And with it, a question growing louder inside me. Was I still allowed to want something just for myself? The days that followed felt quieter, though nothing around me had changed. Mark still left early. The phone still rang in the afternoons with updates from the children. The house still held its soft silences. But within me, a kind of tuning was taking place, a noticing, a gentle reawakening. One morning, I pulled out the watercolor set I used to use when the kids were young. It had been buried in the bottom drawer of the hall cabinet. The colors had faded. Some pans cracked from age. Still, I filled a glass with water, sat by the window, and began to move the brush. It didn't matter what I painted. It was the movement that mattered. The quiet rhythm of color meeting paper, of thoughts softening. I hadn't made time for this version of myself in years. That afternoon, Mark came home with news. The firm was restructuring. There was tension among leadership, and Richard had decided to step down early. He didn't say much to anyone, Mark said, just that it was time. I didn't reply, not right away. The idea of Richard stepping away felt strange, like hearing that a tree you always assumed would stand at the edge of your street had been cut down overnight. Even though we weren't close, even though our exchanges were quiet and rare, he had started to mean something. 2 days later, I found a small envelope in our mailbox. No name on the front, just my address. Inside was a note. Thank you for reminding me that attention can be kind, not heavy. I'm heading out of town for a while, but if you ever want to finish that conversation about poetry, the invitation remains. R. There was no phone number, no return address, just those few lines. That evening, I sat in the armchair near the fireplace and read the note again. It didn't feel unfinished. It felt open. And as I folded the paper and slipped it into the pages of the poetry book he had once brought me, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe. This wasn't about Richard. It wasn't even about being noticed. It was about remembering who I had once been before I stopped asking what I needed. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to ask again. I didn't write back. I wouldn't have known where to send it, even if I had. But Richard's note stayed tucked inside that poetry book, like a pressed leaf, quiet, preserved, unexpected. In the days that followed, something shifted gently inside me. I began to move through my routines not with resignation, but with quiet intention. I set the table even when it was just me. I listened to music in the mornings, something soft and orchestral that filled the space between the walls. I started walking in the afternoons. At first it was just around the block, scarf wrapped around my neck, hands in my coat pockets. But as the days passed, I wandered farther. I let myself get lost on side streets, not lost, just enough to feel the edges of the world again. One afternoon, I found myself at a small secondhand bookshop I hadn't visited in years. It still smelled of old paper and wood polish. I browsed without purpose until I came across a journal, the kind with thick, cream-colored pages and a ribbon to mark your place. I bought it without thinking. That evening, I began to write. At first, it was mundane, what I had cooked for dinner, what the sky looked like before it rained. But soon, the writing shifted. I found myself reflecting on the ways I had disappeared from my own life, little by little. How I had traded curiosity for duty. How I had stopped speaking certain truths out loud because they felt too selfish. I wrote about Richard, not about what he said, but about what it stirred, about how, in the span of a few short conversations, he had held up a mirror I hadn't dared to face in years. And I wrote about myself, the woman I had been, the woman I still might be. One night, as I closed the journal, I whispered something into the quiet room, and still here. Not to anyone in particular, just to the part of me that needed to hear it. Weeks passed. The weather turned cooler. Mark remained busy, the house remained quiet, and the world kept moving in its familiar, steady rhythm. But inside me, something different was growing. A small sense of presence, a willingness to be with myself, to tend to the life I still had. I didn't need a new beginning. I didn't need a grand awakening. I just needed to remember that I mattered. And somehow, through the softest of gestures, a conversation by a window, a gift of books, a handwritten note, I had begun to believe that again. The holidays arrived quietly that year. The children visited briefly, just long enough to leave laughter in the air and clutter in the kitchen. Mark was gracious in his usual way, offering updates about work and helping carry gifts to the car, but he remained distant in the ways I had long accepted. I didn't mind the silence as much anymore. One afternoon in early January, I sat at the dining table and reread parts of my journal. There was something both comforting and painful in seeing my own handwriting speak truths I hadn't said aloud. I wasn't writing for anyone else, just for the sake of honesty. That's when I noticed something tucked inside the back pocket of the journal, a scrap of paper I hadn't placed there. It must have fallen from the poetry book where I had left Richard's note. This one was smaller, folded twice. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Sometimes the smallest acknowledgments become the loudest echoes. No signature, no address. But I didn't need one. It didn't feel like a message to stir something new. It felt like permission to continue. That evening, I made a list. Not resolutions, not goals. Just a list of things I hadn't done in years. Cook something only I wanted to eat. Visit the museum downtown alone. Say no without explanation. Spend an entire afternoon reading, uninterrupted. Sit in the sun and do absolutely nothing. They were small, ordinary things, but to me, they felt revolutionary. I started with the museum. A Tuesday morning, hardly anyone there. I wandered through rooms filled with quiet beauty and let my thoughts slow to match the pace of the stillness around me. One painting in particular held me. An older woman, sitting alone near a window, soft light washing over her hands. Her expression wasn't sad. It was aware, whole. I stood there for a long time. Later that week, I made a dish I used to love, but hadn't cooked in a decade. Mark didn't comment on it. He rarely noticed things like that. But I savored every bite. And as winter began to loosen its grip, I found myself changing in ways I couldn't fully name. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but inwardly, something was softening. I began to believe that this quiet season of my life wasn't just a waiting room for decline. It was its own kind of beginning, a season for noticing, for tending, for returning, not to someone else, but to myself. Spring crept in without ceremony. One morning, I opened the curtains and saw the first crocuses peeking through the soil near the edge of the garden. They hadn't been planted by me. They were remnants from years past. Yet somehow they returned. Delicate, defiant. It struck me how little they asked for, and yet how steadily they arrived. I found myself walking more, sitting in the park with a book I rarely opened. Sometimes I just watched people pass by. A young mother tying her child's shoe, an elderly man feeding birds from a paper sack. A group of teenagers sprawled across the grass, careless in their laughter. Life wasn't loud, but it was undeniably present. One afternoon, as I returned home, I noticed something in the mailbox. A postcard. No name on the front, just an image of a quiet lake in early morning fog. The back held only a few words. There's peace in choosing to be awake to your own life. It was unsigned. I didn't need to wonder. It didn't matter whether it had come from Richard or not. It wasn't about him anymore. That evening, I lit a candle and sat in the stillness of the living room. I held the postcard in one hand, the poetry book in the other, and felt something inside me settle. This wasn't a story of a romance that never happened. It was the story of something far more subtle, a slow and quiet reclamation of a life, of learning to hear one's own voice again, of discovering that being seen can be gentle, a mirror, not a spotlight. I didn't know if I'd ever see Richard again, but I knew what he had given me, and what I had finally allowed myself to receive. A reminder that we are not finished just because the world grows quieter around us. Sometimes, the most unexpected whisper, in a gallery, at a dinner table, on a postcard, can lead us back to ourselves. I tucked the postcard into my journal. Then I poured a cup of tea, opened the window, and let the air move through the room. And in that moment, I wasn't waiting for anything. I was simply living. And that, after everything, was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write to the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.